Over the next 7 weeks, we'll be walking through the final weeks of Jesus' life by looking at a series of events that culminated with the greatest event in all of human history. Everything from Jesus descending into hell, the triumphal entry, crucifixion, resurrection, and everything in between. Join us in person or online as we journey through Jesus' final days on earth and why we're still talking about it nearly 2,000 years later.
Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. Here's a question to think about. What if you had 1 month to live? And this part's crucial. You knew it. You knew it. No matter what you might think, I know many of you watching, you might in particular, might not even believe in much of an afterlife, in one at all. But no matter what you think about what happens after we die, you have, let's just imagine, 1 month to live. As you are living right now, this life, this earth, this time. What would you do with that month? What would you change? How would things be different? How would you spend your time? How would you relate to people? What would you do to make each one of those days count? There'd be an intensity, wouldn't there? I mean, a purpose, almost a sense of mission. It would not be business as usual. Now, we ramp that up a lot. What if you had one last night to live? And again, you knew it. Right now, today, let's just say you knew tomorrow would be your last day on earth and tonight your last night. What would you do? What would you do? Who would you be with, if anyone at all? What would you want to make sure that you did or make sure that you said? What would you feel the need to resolve, to confront, to make clear? We're in a series on the last week of the life of Jesus, the week that culminated in his death, burial, and resurrection. Throughout history, it has become known as Holy Week, a time to focus on the passion or the suffering of Jesus. And in that week, Jesus obviously had a last night, and he knew it was going to be his last one. So what did he do with that last night? Let's find out. The first thing he did was prepare for it. On that last fateful day, Jesus sent out 2 of his followers into the city of Jerusalem to make preparations for a celebration known as the Passover. They had been camping on the outskirts of town, and here's how Mark, author of one of the 4 biographies of Jesus in the Bible, recalled what happened. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go to prepare the Passover meal for you?" So Jesus sent 2 of them into Jerusalem with these instructions. As you go into the city, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him. At the house he enters, say to the owner, "The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?" He will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up. That is where you should prepare our meal. So the 2 disciples went into the city and found everything just as Jesus had said, and they prepared the Passover meal there. Now, there's a couple things to notice about that, how the last night of Jesus began with preparation. First, it began with this strong dose of the supernatural. If you have been tracking with this series at all, you'll know that this was very similar to how Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem at the very start of the week, during what was known as the triumphal entry, or what we celebrate to this day as Palm Sunday. On that day, he sent 2 of his disciples in ahead of him and told them exactly where to find the donkey, one that had never been ridden, that he was going to ride into the city. And if anybody asked who needed it, just tell them the teacher needed it. And they did, and it worked exactly as Jesus told them. This is almost the exact same thing. Go into the city, and when you see a man carrying a water jug, of all things, which would have struck his 2 followers as odd, because in that day and time, men didn't carry water jugs. They weren't the ones that carried water at all. That was a job for women. He would not have been hard to miss. And then he said, follow them, and then tell whoever lives there the master needs the room. It'll even be set up. And again, they just thought, okay. And that's exactly how it played out. Jesus kind of once again being Jesus. But the second thing to take note of is that this was the Passover. Now, this is very important. Let me just take a few moments and just make sure that we understand what the Passover was about, because there's so much about this last night, so much about the Christian faith, so much about Jesus that just, it'd be difficult to understand fully if you didn't understand the Passover, the history of it, the celebration of it, and what Jesus did to fulfill it. So let me take a minute on that. There was a time many centuries ago when the Jewish people were enslaved by the Egyptians. A man by the name of Moses, a name you probably have heard, came along. He was a great leader, and he led them with the help of a plague or two out of bondage and into freedom. It was called the Great Exodus, which literally means the road out or the way out. It actually took 10 plagues from God before the stubborn hearts of the Egyptians would release the Jewish slaves. Now, God didn't want to send the plagues, and he certainly didn't enjoy them, but he loves us too much not to do everything he can to get our attention and to turn us around. So God was not only showing his love for the Jews, he was trying to reach out to the Egyptians as well and soften their hearts. After each plague, if you've read the account, he went back and said, okay, will you let my people go now? Will you turn your hearts toward me as the one true living God now? They wouldn't respond. So each plague grew in gravity and force, one after the other, to no effect. Even 9 didn't do it. So the 10th and decisive plague was the most telling of all, and would result in the death of the firstborn of Egypt. But like all the others, it could have been avoided. God told the Israelites that if they would sacrifice an unblemished lamb, meaning a lamb without defect, perfect in every way, and then take that blood and spread it on their doorposts, the angel of death who was being sent to deliver the 10th and final plague would pass over them. And that's where the term Passover comes from. See, in ancient times, the Bible teaches that God allowed people to sacrifice an animal to make amends for their sins, which can seem strange to us, but it was very intentional by God. He wanted people to see the severity of their sin. He wanted people to see that paying for sin that comes between us and him is messy and gruesome and costly, because sin is messy, gruesome, and costly. And he also wanted us, though, to see his love and his forgiveness and his mercy. So the sacrifice was a substitute for the sinner in place of the sinner's guilt. It bore the sinner's guilt. That's where we get our term scapegoat, which is another biblical term. You've heard of someone being made the scapegoat for something, blaming them, pinning something on them. The term comes from the Bible. The Israelites had an annual Day of Atonement on which the Old Testament priest would make atonement for all the sins of the people. And the scapegoat was the goat to which the sins of the Israelites were symbolically transferred to on that day, and then it was driven off into the wilderness. There would be this laying on of hands representing a confession of guilt on the part of the people and a transfer of guilt to the victim. God also said, as I mentioned, that the animals sacrificed were to be without any kind of blemish or mark. The point, again, this is all very symbolic, was that the sin or the imperfection could only be addressed by perfection, God himself, because the sin was ultimately against him and his law, and only he could offer true forgiveness. It wasn't something that they could address themselves. You can't deal with sin yourself. So the sacrifice was offered to God, but again, it wasn't something that would finally and ultimately bridge the gap between us and God. It was like a stopgap measure as God was trying to make his redemptive plan clear. Which is why throughout that time, the great prophets of God said there would be one who would be coming from God, who would take away the sins of the world once and for all, the one sacrifice for all, the fulfillment of the entire sacrificial system, the Messiah. But back to the Passover. Anyone who wanted to make the sacrifice and fill it with the meaning it was meant to have and make it known would be passed over, Jew or Egyptian. It was a wide open offer for anyone wanting God's mercy. Ultimately, the people of Egypt would not release the Jewish people from slavery. They did not turn to the one true God for mercy, even after seeing all of the plagues unleashed and all that had happened to them. So the angel came. The firstborn of Egypt were killed, and those who had covered their homes with the blood of the Lamb were saved. And it had such an impact, finally, on the leaders of Egypt and the people of Egypt. They finally released the Israelites from slavery. Well, Jews have been celebrating the festival of Passover ever since as this great, grand, glorious reminder of God's deliverance from death and the freedom that came from that deliverance through the blood of a lamb. Well, the festival developed over time, as you would imagine, and eventually involved a lamb that would be slaughtered and eaten, and then unleavened bread, meaning bread without yeast, would be eaten. And if you've ever had bread without yeast, it's bitter. And that was the whole point. So it would have a bitter taste and would remind them of the bitterness of slavery that the blood had released them from. And interestingly, a cup of wine was always set aside as part of the Passover celebration, but not drunk, in case the prophet Elijah came to announce the coming of the Messiah. That was for him to kind of disturb the drink or make it move a little bit, for him to show that he was there or had come and he was going to make the announcement. Which brings us to the second thing Jesus did, which took place when they actually arrived in this upper room and sat down for the meal. Now, to understand what happened next, you got to have a little bit of background on that day and that time. Back in Jesus' day, they didn't have paved roads. They were mostly dirt. People didn't wear shoes like we do. They went barefoot, or they wore what we would call today sandals, open-toed, foot exposed. Not only that, but the major form of transportation on these roads, if it wasn't walking, was by donkey or camel. The roads were also used to move large groups of cattle or sheep or goats. So you had dirt, you had manure, you had urine, and whatever else you had that you walked. And if it rained, you didn't want to be on the road. It was just a filthy, muddy, nasty mess. So here's what was customary throughout that day and time. Whenever you'd go to an inn, for example, or a friend's house, or for a meal or a party, there'd be somebody at the door, usually a paid servant, who had a basin of water and a towel, and they would wash and then dry your feet. But people's feet would be so nasty. It was considered arguably the lowliest job you could possibly have. And if by chance, if there wasn't a paid servant to do the job, well then, first person who had arrived would kind of do it until someone of appropriately lower rank would be pulled into service. But if there wasn't anyone there to do that, then whoever did take it upon themselves to wash feet was essentially saying, I am less than you. And the person who had their feet washed by that would say, and I am superior to you, or at least feel that way. Okay, got all that in your head? Here's how John describes what happened when they all got there in his biography of Jesus in the Bible. Jesus got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them. Catch what happened? Here Jesus was with his disciples, gathered for the Passover feast. There was no one at the door to wash feet. Not a single one of Jesus' followers had volunteered for the position. So there they all sat around the table with proud hearts and dirty feet. No one would bring himself to assume such a lowly role. They didn't want to be seen as less than the others until Jesus got there. And he took one look at their feet, a deeper look into their hearts. And he, Jesus, without saying a word, started washing each and every foot. And then after he was done and had taken his seat, he gave them one final life lesson. He said, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. So on his last night, Jesus prepared, Jesus served, and taught others to serve. And then he did a third thing. It was the result of a moment of drama, that has echoed throughout time, involving a name now known around the world, Judas Iscariot. When you hear the word Judas, what comes to mind? Evil, betrayal. It didn't start off that way. Don't just get the tail end of the story, get the whole story. He was chosen as one of the 12 to follow Jesus for 3 years. 3 years of teaching and modeling, 3 years of miracles and seeing blind see and crippled walk and the dead being raised. But in spite of all that he had heard and all that he had seen, even in spite of Jesus himself, Judas turned his back on faith. I heard one writer put it this way: there was never been a greater tragedy. Feet that walked so close to Christ, yet a heart that lagged behind at such a distance. Many have wondered why Judas betrayed Jesus. In truth, we don't know. Some say it was because of greed. I mean, he was paid for his betrayal, but in truth, it wasn't that much money. Some say he was a zealot, someone who had followed Jesus only because he thought Jesus would create an army and overthrow Rome and assume political power. And when it's clear that wasn't the kind of Messiah Jesus was going to be, particularly as that final week played out, Judas turned angry and bitter and wanted Jesus dead and gone as much as anyone. We don't know his reasons. We only know he did it, and in the most hurtful way, most betraying way imaginable. Again, let's turn to John's account. Now, Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at each other, wondering whom he could mean. Simon Peter motioned to the disciple sitting next to Jesus at the table to ask, "Who's he talking about?" So that disciple leaned over to Jesus and asked, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus responded, "It is the one to whom I give the bread I dip in the bowl." And when he had dipped it, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. When Judas had eaten the bread, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus told him, "Hurry and do what you're going to do." None of the others at the table knew what Jesus meant. Since Judas was their treasurer, some thought Jesus was telling him to go and pay for the food or to give some money to the poor. So Judas left at once, going out into the night. Again, I don't think any of us can imagine the pain of that moment for Jesus, the grief, because make no mistake, he loved Judas. He had handpicked him to follow him. He'd poured 3 years of his life into him. He had tried to win Judas' heart, and he'd failed. Even here at the end, he was still trying. And we know that, little background. First, know about eating with someone during that day and time. If you ate with someone, it was considered one of the most intimate relational events that you could possibly share. If you ate with them or you agreed to eat with them, it meant you were in a close relationship. It represented peace and trust and forgiveness and brotherhood, which is why to betray a friend after eating with them was, and actually still is in the Middle East, regarded as the worst kind of treachery. But there's more. It was customary for the master of the feast to put a little bit of lamb onto a piece of bread, dip it into some herb sauce, and then hand it to his guest. And it was customary to offer the very first piece to the most honored guest. And the Bible says that Jesus took that first piece, took that bread, and handed it to Judas to take and eat, almost as if it was a last act of love toward the one who would betray him, a last chance for Judas to turn and change his ways. But instead of opening his heart to Jesus, we read that he opened his heart instead to the evil one. So Judas ran out into the night, his feet freshly cleaned from when Jesus had just washed them, leaving behind a Jesus who had tried so hard for so long to reach this man, even to the very end. So on his last night, Jesus prepared, Jesus served, Jesus tried. And then Jesus did something else. He fulfilled. Because what Jesus did next was introduce them to what we often look back on as the heart of the night, the institution of what we call the Lord's Supper. Let's take a look at it through Luke's account. Jesus took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." Okay, that blew them away because they were there for the Passover. And Jesus here gives the Passover a radical revolution, one that rocked their world and rocked all of history, because Jesus said, Now, this wine and bread is to have an entirely new meaning. It is to represent me as the unblemished lamb that was sacrificed. And those that are marked by my blood will be freed from the slavery of their sin and will be passed over from the spiritual death that comes from sin. Jesus said, from now on, do this in remembrance of me. This is the new memorial meal for those who are part of the family of God. The bread is to be eaten, but in remembrance of my body broken for you. And there is to be wine as a symbol of my blood, but my blood shed on the cross. Okay, there's so much symbolism here that's important to get. When you celebrated the Passover the way that there were so many stages and moments as you would go through the night. It was akin to a service, almost a liturgy, a series of acts and recitations and prayers and songs that took you through the history and the meaning of Passover, not least of which was the cup of wine. Actually, 4 cups of wine that were taken throughout the celebration, each representing a different aspect of the Passover. The meaning of each was taken from the Old Testament book of Exodus, which records God's promise about the Exodus. That's actually worth a read. Let me do that. And God said to Moses, I am Yahweh, the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. I promised to give them the land of Canaan where they were living as foreigners. You can be sure that I have heard the groans of the people of Israel, who are now slaves to the Egyptians, and I am well aware of my covenant with them. Therefore, say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will free you from your oppression, will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who has freed you from your oppression in Egypt. I will bring you into the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as your very own possession. I am the Lord. Wow. Well, each of the 4 cups taken throughout the Passover celebration represented a different aspect of that promise, a different part of God's saving word. The first cup was called the Cup of Sanctification, or purification, based on God's promise to bring them out of Egypt. The second cup was the Cup of Deliverance, sometimes called the Cup of Plagues, based on God's promise to free them and what was involved in freeing them. The third cup was known as the Cup of Redemption, which was God's promise to save or redeem them. And then the fourth cup was the Cup of Protection, based on God's promise to take them as their own, take care of them as his own. But it was the third of those 4 cups, based on the sequence of the meal that we have recorded for us in the Bible, that Jesus would have raised to his lips and said, do this in remembrance of me. The cup of redemption, the cup that represented the slaying of the lamb, the blood of which allowed judgment to pass over. Can you imagine being in the room when that came out? It was mind-blowing. He was informing them that now he was the true sacrificial lamb for the Passover, that his death would now serve as the deliverance of God's people from sin, that God was calling his people out of a deeper slavery than had ever existed under the Egyptians, the very slavery of sin, into a new community and relationship with the living God. The church is the new Israel, and through Jesus, the Passover had reached its ultimate fulfillment and celebration. And ever since that moment, the celebration of the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table, communion, Eucharist, we've heard it in many names, has been one of the church's most sacred acts. Now, there is a 5th cup in the ceremony that is set aside that no one drinks from, that I mentioned earlier. It's either called the Cup of Elijah, sometimes it's called the Cup of Wrath. The idea is that it is set aside for the prophet Elijah, who is forecast to come before the Messiah to announce the coming of the Messiah. And it represented God's wrath or judgment that would come on the world through the Messiah. Now hold that thought, but for now, a little footnote. Elijah had come. Jesus told the disciples he had come. Here's where it came out in an earlier conversation, this from Matthew's biography. Then his disciples asked him, why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes? Jesus replied, Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, but he wasn't recognized, and they chose to abuse him. And in the same way, they will also make the Son of Man suffer. Then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. So now all that was left for everything to be fulfilled was for the fifth and final cup to be drunk. But it wasn't drunk then. So what happened next? The final act, the final intentionality of Jesus' last night. Jesus went to one of his favorite places, a place that he often went to withdraw and to think and to rest, and most of all to pray. It was called Gethsemane. Gethsemane was a garden or an orchard on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives overlooking the city. It's still there to this day to be visited. The name Gethsemane is Hebrew, and it means oil press, which refers to it as a place for squeezing oil from olives. It was his last night on earth, and that's where he wanted to go. And it was one of the most tender, poignant moments we have recorded from his life, captured in countless paintings and described movingly in scores of devotionals and portrayed in so many films. The Garden of Gethsemane is one of the most moving moments of Jesus' life, not just in regard to what it was for Jesus as a retreat, but what it was for him as a defining moment for what was to come. The scene is recorded in great detail in the Bible. Again, let's read from Matthew's biography. Then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." He took Peter and Zebedee's two sons, James and John, and he became anguished and distressed. And he told them, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death. Stay here. Keep watch with me." He went on a little farther and bowed with his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." And then the Bible goes on to say that Jesus went back and prayed that same prayer, fervently and passionately at length, 2 more times. In Luke's description of the scene, there's a detail added to Matthew's account, where he says, "And he was in such agony of spirit that his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood." And that was not figurative language. Jesus was sweating blood. There's a medical name for what was happening with him, hematidrosis. It's a very rare condition, but it can happen when someone is suffering extreme, and I mean extreme levels of stress. It's related to our body's fight or flight response. So what was happening? What was weighing on him in such a horrific way? It was that fifth and final cup. He was about to drink it. A cup that was not meant to be drunk by anyone really, but the Messiah set aside for him for the sake of the world. You see, the anguish in Jesus' soul was not simply death, but the kind of death it would be. He would drink the cup of God's wrath on sin. According to the Christian faith, the death of Jesus wasn't just a death. It was a representative death. It was a substitutionary death. The death of Jesus would involve the taking of the sin of all humanity upon himself. That was the point. That's why the death would matter. That's why it would be for you and for me. At the moment of his death, Jesus would carry the weight of the sins of the world. I mean, just imagine that. Every rape, every murder, every lie, every betrayal, every adulterous relationship, every act of child abuse, the hunger pangs from every famine, every winter chill from homelessness, every addiction, the sordid world of pornography, the chains of slavery and human trafficking. When he died, he would carry the evil of terrorism and genocide, the Nazi Holocaust, the horrors of Dachau. He would shoulder the acts of people like Jeffrey Dahmer, and Adolf Hitler, and Charles Manson, and Saddam Hussein, and every sin I've ever done, and every sin you've ever done. In a single blazing, soul-wrenching moment, the sins of the world would be on his shoulders, and he would carry their stain, their weight, their pain, their evil, their darkness. He would be that sin and then die in payment for it. No wonder he sweat drops of blood, which is why he prayed to the Father that if there could be any other way, any other remedy, make it known. But, and this is the most important thing, with a final word, not my will, but yours. It's been said that bravery, true bravery, isn't the absence of fear. It's not a reckless disregard for fear or danger. Courage is when you have every reason to be afraid, every sense of the danger with total clarity, and yet you go forward with what it is you need to do. You sweat drops of blood, and then still willingly go to the cross. Well, then the last night of Jesus ended. He rose from that prayer, and into the garden came a mob of soldiers led by Judas. It was time. It was time. And that is where we will start the clock next week. The trial and execution of the Son of God. But let's not forget his last night. The intentionality of what he did, the purposefulness of it, the reason for it. And there was a reason, one huge, overarching, all-encompassing reason for every single part of it. It's you. You. And it still is. He prepares a room for you, a room to meet, to eat, to talk, to make clear. He willingly washes your feet, no matter how filthy they are. As Jesus himself said, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life away. And that includes you. He gives you bread from the meal, knowing that in giving it to you, you may betray him, have betrayed him, hoping that your heart will soften. He is the Lamb of sacrifice for you. He lifts up the cup and offers it to you to drink in remembrance of him, in remembrance of what he has done for you. He anguished in the garden over your sin. Make no mistake, one of those drops of blood had your name on it, reflecting on your sins, each and every one, and what it would take to bear your sins, what it would take to pay for your sins. And he willingly did it. The last night of Jesus was all about you. The question is whether for you, the last night will be all about Jesus. Really think about it. For Jesus, it was all about you. For you, it should be all about Jesus. And you will have a last night. The only difference is that you probably won't be able to plan for it. It will come upon you and you won't even know that it's your last one. The only way that it can be about Jesus is if you make it about Jesus now, before that last night comes, before it arrives. He's prepared a place. He's washed your feet. He's offered you forgiveness. He's paid the price for your sins. He's gone to the cross. All for you. Now the question is whether you are going to make it all about him. And you can. You can. He prayed for you that last night. Will you pray to him now about your last night? You can. And I want to at least give you the opportunity, the space and the time to do that. So instead of me closing us in prayer, let me just leave that prayer with you. And you do with it as you will. But if it's never been a prayer you've prayed before, I so hope that you'll pray it today.